Alright, so in this short video, we're going to have the train actually follow the tracks. So as you can see from here, we have the actual the train wheels moving alongside having a track for the train to follow. So, you know, as you can see in the last video, this is what we did. And to make the train actually follow the track is a very simple process. So we can just get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn on my screencast keys. And now the second thing I'm going to do is press Shift A and add in an empty and a cube. This is just so that we can move the entire train as, a single unit, because it is made up of a few different things such as the wheels, the rod, and the main body. So this is why I usually do when I have multiple objects in one scene. So just scale it up to the dimensions of the train, and something like that is good. And then in wireframe mode, what we're going to do is box select everything. However, we do need to deselect the what's these things called? The coupling rods. That's because they are already somewhat parented to the curve. So if we parent that to the empty, then our animation won't work. However, everything else is fine, so we can just parent that to the empty. So make sure that the empty is the color in orange, because that is our active selection. So with that selected last, we can press Ctrl P and set parent to object and keep transform. Also, I noticed that we have the sunlight, or I selected the sunlight as well. I'll just quickly delete that. So now I can move everything onto the track. And when I press play, the wheels are still running as expected or as hoped for. So this means that we can actually just get the train running on the tracks. Let me just quickly make sure that the wheels, even these behind wheels here, are on the track properly. So I'll just press G and X to move out, like so. And there we go. So now, to make it follow the track, all we need to do is select our empty here, select the curve here, press Ctrl P, and set parent to follow path. So now, let me just extend the path much longer, and then bring the empty all the way back here. Now, if I press play, we should get, although it's running quite slowly because I'm using a laptop, we are getting our train following the track. Isn't that fantastic? So there we go. We have our train animation almost done. So the last thing to add in will be the steam, and then we will be done for the animation section of this tutorial series. So I guess I will see you in the next one. Alright, so in this video, we will be making the steam that is coming out of the steam train. So let's get started. So what we can do is first click on our train and tap into edit mode. And in this little steam chimney thing here, what we're going to do is alt click this edge loop in edge select mode, like so, and then press Shift D to duplicate it. I'll just right click to reset its position and scale it down a little bit, and then press F to fill. Now, if you tab out of edit mode, as you can see, it has some weird shadows, and that's because of the normals. But the way that we can make it right is by pressing Shift N. Hopefully you memorize how to do that. And if it still doesn't look right, all you need to do is click this inside box here, and then the normals should be looking right. Once you've done that, we can actually separate it from the main object by pressing P and separate by selection. So just make sure that this is selected before you do that. And then we can tab out of edit mode and just bring this down ever so slightly on the Z axis by pressing G and Z. Alright, so the way that we're going to create steam is by using a particle system. Now, particle systems aren't used as often in like Blender 3.3 and above because of geometry nodes. However, I feel like using particle systems in this instance is going to be quite suitable and a lot easier than the particle or the geometry nodes. So we can start by selecting our object here and then going over to the particle settings tab, which is this one here. Press the plus icon to add in a new particle system, and I can just rename this to something like steam. I don't know why it didn't change here, so I'll just name this to steam as well. So if I just press, this backwards arrow here on our object and just press the play button, as you can see, we already have things being emitted from our train. We have these little white circles that are being emitted, and these are known as halos. Now, halos are a bit strange. They're not like real objects, they're like placeholder materials or placeholder icons for your particle system. And preferably, we'd like to use real objects. This is so that we can actually add in some materials to our steam. So what we can do is press Shift A and add in a mesh and a icosphere. Now, an icosphere is like a regular sphere, except it is made up of triangles and it has a bit less geometry. So that means that when we have a lot of them in our steam, we won't be as taxing on our computers. So if we want as well, you can decrease the subdivisions if, your laptop or computer is already struggling quite a bit with the amount of geometry in the scene. But I'll leave it at 2 subdivisions. Let me just move my train so that it's on the tracks at frame 1. Then what I can do is select our little emitter here and scroll down to the objects or the render panel here. So just make sure to expand that. And as you can see, we have render as halo. However, we want to change this to render as object. And then for our instance object, it will be the icosphere that we added in. So select the eyedropper tool and select your icosphere. Now, if we press play, and I'll just pause it about here and zoom in, as you can see, we have a lot of tiny little icospheres. So there we go. We already have the very basics to our steam. However, there are many settings that we can add in and change so that it looks a bit more like actual steam. So the first thing that we can do is scroll up to the top here, and when I press play, you can see that the steam actually lasts quite a while before disappearing. And this is already too much. So what we can do is decrease the lifetime. So this is basically just how long the particles will be in the scene for. And we can go over to the lifetime and type in something like 20 maybe, and press enter. Then we can just scroll out and press play. And you should see that they disappear after a little bit. However, I believe that we can decrease this even more. So change the lifetime to 10 maybe, or even less, we'll see. So there we go. So they stop at a reasonable distance. However, another thing about this is that they are clipping with the actual train, and that's not something that we want. We at least want the steam to go above the train and then back. So there are a few settings that we can do to change this, and one of them is to scroll down to the field weights and change the gravity down to something like 0. And this is because steam isn't really affected by the weight of gravity because it's so light. However, in some instances, I'll even bring this to like a minus 0.1 just so that it rises a bit. So 0 or minus 0.1 is fine, as you can see. I'll leave it at negative 0.1. And then also what I can do is scroll all the way up to velocity. And even now, with the gravity set to minus 0.1, it's still getting clipped with the train. So one thing that you can do is just change the velocity. And this will be the exit velocity of your steam. So the upwards velocity. So if I change this to something like a 3 and press enter, go all the way back to the start of your scene and then press play. As you can see, it is rising above the actual train bits, and it's not getting clipped, which is exactly what we want. If you want, you can also increase this even more. Maybe you want an even greater distance, and that also works. So 4, 3, just play around with it until you get something that you're happy with. And also, I do decrease the mass because, again, the mass of steam is very low. So if I decrease that to a 0.1, we can also just see how that looks. That looks pretty good. So another setting that we can change to make the steam look a bit more realistic is the Brownian. And Brownian is just a term used in physics to describe the random motion of particles. So if we increase the Brownian, we can actually increase the random motion of our steam particles. So let's just increase this to something like a 2 and see how that looks. A bit hard to see, but it is scattering a bit more. As you can see, they're not all in one line. So if you want to bring this up even more, let's just bring it up to an 8 for argument's sake. You can see that they're dispersing a lot more. So play around with the Brownian, but I think a humble 2 is what I'll be going for. And then finally, what we can add in are some children. So children are basically, I guess, extra particles that you can add. So for every particle, it has children particles. So I'll change this from none to simple and then press play. And as you can see, we have way more particles. I'll decrease this down to a 5 for the display and the render because we don't want that many particles. So I think 5 is good. And there are quite a few settings that we can change. So I first forgot in the render properties to change the scale randomness. So this means that for every particle, there will be a slight variation in the size, and that again adds to the realism. So I'll bring this up to like a 0.7 maybe. And as you can see, we have some small particles, some large particles, and that just adds some variation to the scene. And also you can increase the size of your particles. So if you increase it to a 1, then they're the exact same size as your original particle, but we wouldn't want that. But maybe increase it to like a 0.075. I think that's fine. And then in your children settings, you can also increase the randomness to like a 0.8, maybe. That's a bit much because some particles are already small. Then if you add even more smallness to them, it gets even smaller. I don't know if that made sense, but hopefully you get what I mean. And then the children can also be a little bit smaller, maybe a 0.8. And then also, you can change a few settings, such as the radius. So if you increase the radius, they're more dispersed. This is just completely useless, but, you can increase the radius just so that the steam, or decrease, so that the steam can separate a bit more. And then also, what I found quite useful is clumping. So for every child particle, they will kind of be quite close to their parent particle. So as you can see, with an increased clumping, they actually get drawn closer together. But it depends on. So if you have a very small clumping at the start, they'll be clumped together, but then they'll dissipate as they progress in the scene. So they're quite clumped and then they disperse, which is kind of quite realistic. But I won't bring the clumping down that much. It'll be a negative 0.3. Then what we can do is, in steam, I guess, or in most smokes, or vapors, I should say, the particle size goes from a highly dense region to a less dense region. That's also known as, I think, osmosis or diffusion. So we can actually mimic this by having the particles be large when they exit this little chimney and get smaller as they trail off. And the way we do this is by using a texture. So we can scroll down to the bottom here and add in a new texture. And we can call this texture steam. Whoops, I don't know what happened there, so let me do that again. So, scroll all the way down, and yeah, just call this steam. Apologies, steam. Then we can go to our texture properties, and at the top here, we already have our texture name, so that's good. And what we can do is change our texture just so that it mimics this progression from a highly dense region to a low dense region. And we can change the type from image or movies to blend. And this simulates the perfect progression from concentrated region to non-concentrated region. So there's a few settings that we can change. And we can scroll down to the color ramp settings here. And as you can see, we have a color ramp, which means we will be able to adjust our settings. Usually I change this from linear to B-spline because that is, I guess, the best way to create, or it just adds the best progression, in my opinion.